This episode of Mr. Hutchings History is now streaming on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite platforms like Castbox, Podcast Addict, and Amazon Music. Tune in now.
Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
So, ready to dive into how the U.S. went from stay out of it to a major player in World War II.
A fascinating period, really. Public opinion, politics, global events, all colliding.
Yeah, like a perfect storm. We're lucky to have this great podcast episode from Mr. Hutchings to guide us. It's like having him right here giving us a personal lecture.
It really does feel that way.
Okay, so picture this. It's 1939. World War II breaks out in Europe.
And the U.S.
Still reeling from World War I. And the Depression, of course. Talk about reasons to stay isolated.
Absolutely. The overwhelming feeling was, let's not get entangled in another European war. WWII was still so raw.
And then there's the Nye Committee.
Right.
They basically said, hey, we got dragged into the last war for economic reasons, not good ones. Bankers, arms manufacturers, they made a killing while our soldiers paid the price.
Exactly. Poured fuel on the fire of isolationism, it did. This distrust of interventionism, the desire to not repeat those mistakes, it led to the Neutrality Acts.
Those laws were like a keep-out sign to the rest of the world, weren't they?
Yeah, keeping us out of foreign conflicts, no arms sales to countries at war, things like that.
But you've got President Roosevelt watching Hitler in Europe, and he's getting worried.
The tough spot for him. He sees the danger, but most Americans are firmly against getting involved.
A real balancing act. So he gives that fireside chat in September 1939. Officially, it's all about neutrality.
All right.
But then he slips in this line, even a neutral cannot be asked to close his mind or his conscience. Subtle. Powerful.
Testing the waters, wasn't he? Trying to gently shift the conversation.
But he's up against some serious opposition. I mean, the America First Committee, that's a force to be reckoned with.
The biggest anti-war organization in U.S. history, wasn't it? A huge cross-section of people all united against intervention.
And they have a spokesperson, Charles Lindbergh.
Oh, yeah.
He's saying, look, Britain's going to lose anyway. Why bother getting involved? We need to focus on defending our own borders.
Think about it. The Depression's still lingering. Memories of WWII are fresh. Lindbergh's message, stay out of Europe's mess, it really resonated.
People wanted security, stability, anything but another war. So while the isolationists are gaining steam, what's Roosevelt doing?
He's quietly looking for ways to help the Allies without sparking outrage back home.
Enter the cash and carry provision.
Ah, yes. Part of that 1939 Neutrality Act. It said countries at war could buy stuff from the U.S., but they had to pay cash, and they had to transport it themselves.
On the surface, totally neutral. But practically speaking.
Well, Britain had the ships to make it work. Germany, not so much.
Roosevelt's playing it smart, edging the U.S. closer, little by little.
Clever maneuvering. But then there's another big player who enters the scene, Winston Churchill.
And this guy, Churchill, he knows Britain needs America. And he knows how to work Roosevelt.
A master of persuasion, that Churchill. Their letters back and forth, they show a real bond between them, a shared belief in democracy,
But Churchill's not just sending friendly notes, is he? He's constantly reminding Roosevelt, this is about more than just Britain. This is about the future of freedom.
Appealing to Roosevelt's sense of duty, yeah.
And this leads to a major turning point. The Lend-Lease Act in 1941.
That was huge. Now the U.S. is directly supplying the Allies with weapons and all kinds of military equipment.
No more pretending it's just about business, right?
Now it's about U.S. national security.
Which makes it a lot easier to sell to the American people. Helping the Allies becomes about protecting ourselves, too. And all this is happening while news of the Blitz is hitting America.
London burning, families hiding in shelters. The Blitz really brought the war home to Americans.
You see those images, you can't help but feel for the British. Suddenly, staying neutral doesn't feel so safe anymore.
It becomes less about Europe's problem and more about a global threat.
It's like the isolationist argument is starting to crumble. Public opinion's shifting. Even Gallup polls are showing more Americans are willing to risk war to help Britain.
Roosevelt's groundwork is paying off. But there's a catch.
Right, the U.S. military in 1940.
Not exactly a fighting force ready for global war.
Tiny, under-equipped, you name it. And to think, this is the nation that's about to become a superpower.
So Roosevelt has to act. He knows it.
The first peacetime draft in U.S. history. The Selective Training and Service Act. Controversial, but necessary.
He's sending a message, isn't he? Things are getting serious.
He's also ramping up military spending, getting production going,
Preparing for a fight most people hoped would never come.
taking risks, pushing boundaries. Then, December 7th, 1941, everything changes.
Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
A date which will live in infamy. Devastating, but it really unified the nation. Isolationists.
Uh-huh.
Gone. Basically overnight.
The debate's over. America's at war. It's amazing, thinking about all the different ways historians look at this period. Mr. Hutchings mentioned some of those different views in his podcast, like the consensus school.
Yeah.
What do they say exactly? I'm not really familiar with that term.
Well, the consensus school historians, they focus on this idea that even before Pearl Harbor, most Americans agreed fascism, it had to be stopped.
Okay.
The debate was more about how do we do it
Right.
and when do we do it? Should we jump right into the fighting or should we just help the Allies out?
So it wasn't just a simple isolationist versus interventionists kind of thing.
Right. It wasn't black and white. There were shades of gray.
Yeah.
You had the America First people totally against getting involved. Then others, they thought helping the Allies was important, even if it meant war. And some, they thought we should be more active militarily.
And where does Lend-Lease fit in all of this? Mr. Hutchings, he seemed to think that was a big deal.
Oh, absolutely. Lend-Lease was like political genius.
Mm-hmm.
Roosevelt gets around the hardcore isolationists in Congress, sends help to the Allies,
Right.
but he presents it as, hey, this is about protecting America too.
Keeping everyone happy.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And it shows how much influence Churchill had. He never stopped reminding everyone how much the U.S. and Britain had in common, their goals, values, all of that.
It's like Churchill's this voice in Roosevelt's ear saying, think bigger picture, man. And their relationship, their personal connection, that really mattered, didn't it?
Big time. Churchill, he knew how to talk to Roosevelt, how to appeal to his sense of duty, his belief in democracy.
And then, on top of everything else, there's the Blitz. No speech could do what those images did, bringing the war right into American homes.
London on fire. Just imagine the impact that had on people. The sense of, hey, we might be next.
Suddenly, staying neutral doesn't seem so smart anymore.
Right. It shifts from it's Europe's problem to this is a threat to everyone. And the isolationist argument starts to weaken because people are realizing this is about the fate of democracy itself.
And that's why Lend-Lease was so well-timed, wasn't it? It plays into this feeling that, okay, we have to do something. This isn't just about charity anymore.
Yeah, getting the country ready for war mentally and practically. And speaking of practical matters, we can't forget about the U.S. military back in 1940.
Yeah, totally unprepared.
I mean, seriously unprepared. Smaller than Romania's army, believe it or not. Lacking basic equipment, modern weapons. It's wild to think this is the country that's about to become a superpower.
So Roosevelt steps up. He gets the peacetime draft going, the Selective Training and Service Act. That was a bold move, right? Lots of opposition to that.
Huge risk. But he had to do something.
Increases military spending, too. Gets the factories churning.
Preparing for a war nobody really wanted. But then, Pearl Harbor changes the game entirely.
December 7th, 1941. And the question that had been hanging over everyone, will the U.S. get involved?
Well, that question was answered.
In the most dramatic way possible. But now there's a new question, isn't there? What if we had acted sooner? Would the whole war have played out differently? Would history itself be different? I mean, it's a question that's been debated forever, hasn't it?
Oh, yeah. No easy answers there. It really comes down to how you see all the events that led up to the war.
Mr. Hutchings, in his podcast, he talked about another school of thought, too, the Realist school. What's their take on all of this?
So the realist historians, guys like George Kennan, they're all about national self-interest, power dynamics, that sort of thing. They say countries, they mainly act to protect themselves, their interests, morals, they take a back seat.
So the U.S. joining the war, for them, it wasn't so much about fighting fascism. It was more about protecting American interests.
Right. The realists would probably say Roosevelt, he was always looking out for America, even when he was saying we'd stay neutral. They see things like cash and carry, Lend-Lease, all of that as calculated moves,
It's amazing how different perspectives can change the whole story, isn't it? History's complicated, that's for sure.
It really is. It's not just dates and facts, right? It's about ideas, motivations, everything that's going on behind the scenes. If you really want to understand what happened, you have to look at all of that.
So, thinking about everything we've discussed, what are the big lessons here? What should our listener take away from this whole journey from isolationism to war?
Well, one big thing, I think, is that history, it doesn't follow a straight line. It's messy, it's unpredictable, so many things happen that we can't control.
Like a puzzle, right? We're always trying to make the pieces fit, but sometimes they just don't.
Exactly. You see that with World War II. Public opinion, it's changing because of things like the Blitz. You've got leaders like Roosevelt, Churchill trying to figure out this complicated situation. And then you've got this threat, this growing power, Nazi Germany. It all comes together, it creates this, like, tipping point.
And yeah, we can't go back in time and change anything, but understanding these turning points, these moments in history, it can help us make better choices now.
Absolutely. Foreign policy, domestic politics, anything, really. Knowing our history, it helps us learn from our mistakes, helps us face the challenges we have today.
It's like even something that seems small, like that cash and carry thing, it can have huge consequences down the line. It shows how everything's connected, how our choices can have ripple effects.
And I think the most important thing maybe is this. Think for yourself. Be open-minded. Look at different perspectives. That's how we get a real understanding of the past. And that's how we make better decisions in the future.
So for our listener who wants to keep learning about all of this, what would you recommend? Where should they go from here?
Well, Mr. Hutchings' podcast, that's a great place to start. He does a really nice job of giving you an overview, hits the main points, keeps it interesting.
Yeah, I agree. And there's tons of other stuff out there too. Books, articles, documentaries. It's a fascinating period of history.
Oh, definitely. And remember, history, it's not just about the past.
Right.
It affects us now.
Yeah.
It's still shaping our world. The more we understand about where we've been, the better we can understand where we are, where we might be going.
Well put. I think that's a great place to wrap up our deep dive for today. We've covered a lot, but hopefully our listener has a better understanding of how the U.S. went from isolationism to war, and even more importantly, what we can learn from it all.
It's been great discussing all of this with you.
You too. Until next time, folks, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep learning from history.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings' History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.